Kia ora koutou, ko Amelia Sharman Takawangawa. I'm Amelia Sharman, Director of Sustainability Reporting here at the XRB. And today's webinar is about a draft climate reporting roadmap that we published. I'm here with my colleague, Lisa Kelsey, Technical Director of Sustainability Reporting. And between us, hopefully we can answer all of your questions. So the focus of today's webinar is really information sharing to help you understand the draft roadmap and how to respond to the consultation. So we'll cover off three things today. Firstly, the proposals in the draft roadmap, what we're proposing and why we're proposing that. Secondly, the information that we're seeking through the consultation. And then thirdly, how the consultation will run and how you can provide feedback to us. We're not seeking feedback during today's webinar, but very happy to answer any questions you've got about the consultation document and the process. And if you do have any early feedback, we will take that on board, but we really want to make sure you've got enough time to read everything, digest, and then come back to us. So just a reminder, if you've got questions, please put them in the Q&A function and we'll keep an eye on that throughout the webinar. So we'll start with the proposals in the draft roadmap. And this section is really going to focus on that proposed direction for climate reporting in New Zealand, the key drivers for change and the principles underlying the roadmap. The draft roadmap sets out the proposed what, why, and when for climate reporting in New Zealand. It is proposing a strategic direction. It is not a final decision. Nothing is changing while the consultation is underway. Aotearoa New Zealand climate standards do continue to apply unless and until any decisions are made following the consultation. So those are definitely still the requirements that are in action. And then after the consultation finishes, the XRB does intend to issue a final climate reporting roadmap later this year to provide that regulatory certainty about the strategic direction. Why are we issuing this roadmap now? Climate reporting is evolving internationally. Many jurisdictions are adopting or using International Sustainability Standards Board standards. And as I'm sure most of you know, Australia has also legislated their phased climate reporting regime. They are using the ISSB standards, and the ISSB standards have also been endorsed by IOSCO for consideration by member jurisdictions, of which New Zealand is one. We have also heard a lot about what you are looking for in terms of stakeholders. So that is the preparers of climate reporting, the climate reporting entities, as well as users and those assisting entities with the preparation of their statements. And we issued that request for information last year on the international alignment of climate reporting. And key messages we heard through that RFI process was a very strong demand for international alignment, stability, and a phased approach to change. We are trying really hard to respond directly to that RFI feedback, and I'll explain as we go on in the webinar how we're doing that specifically through the principle to underpin the draft roadmap. And then finally, we have some changes to our domestic settings. So the government has announced proposed changes to the definition of climate reporting entity, which are currently in legislation before the House. So in response to all of those drivers collectively, we have aimed to respond and to set this proposed direction for the next phase of climate reporting. The draft roadmap is based on three principles. The first is international alignment, so responding very much to what we heard last year. And how we're proposing implementing that principle is through the adoption of the IFRS Foundation's standard, that's the ISSB, their International Sustainability Standards Board, their standard IFRS S2 climate-related disclosures. And so we would adopt that standard into New Zealand as the basis for a new New Zealand climate standard. The second is harmonising with Australia. From that RFI last year, we heard, in terms of jurisdictions, that we heard the most demand for alignment with. Australia was the number one. So we will consider any modifications to IFRS S2 to align with how Australia's regulatory settings have been implemented. So those are situations, and I'll get into those a bit later, about where that core standard, IFRS S2, differs in the way that Australia has implemented it in their jurisdiction. And then the third principle that we have focused on is this idea of local relevance. And that is considering what modifications are needed to make sure that the standard works in New Zealand. And in general, all of these three principles are intended to support the XRB's strategy, which is internationally aligned, locally relevant standards that are fit for purpose in New Zealand. So I'll get into a bit more detail now about what those three principles mean in practice. So international alignment. In practice, as I said, this means adopting IFRS S2, climate-related disclosures, together with adopting the climate-relevant portions of IFRS S1. What is IFRS S1? That is the general requirement standard that the ISSB has put out. And so in order to establish a climate-specific standard, we need to pull in those bits of S1 into a system that works with S2 to make it standalone. Different jurisdictions have done this in different ways, so we're really keen to think about and hear your views maybe on how that should be done. As I said, we think that this aligns with global practice. Most of New Zealand's major trading partners, gone a bit too fast. That's me. Most of New Zealand's major trading partners, are using that ISSB standard as a basis. China's climate-related disclosure standard uses IFRS S2 as a basis, Australia, etc. So we're very much aiming, therefore, to align with global direction and improve that comparability between the disclosures that are published here and the disclosures that are published elsewhere to enable that more free-flowing global capital. We're also aiming to provide a clearer future state rather than making piecemeal amendments to NZCS. We did hear through that RFI on international alignment that some people were very keen to keep NZCS and to align it. However, as we have tried to do that and think about how that would work, we realize actually that would be really very difficult to do in practice, and we might end up with some unintended consequences and misalignment because of just the different ways that those standards are written. In terms of benefits and costs, while we know that there will be transition costs to this new standard, the proposed new standard, we do expect that the benefits of international alignment will outweigh those costs in the longer term and across the majority of entities. Second principle is harmonisation with Australia. And as I said, feedback from the RFI indicated that Australia was the key jurisdiction for New Zealand to consider. We heard very clearly that harmonisation would support more comparable climate information across the trans-Tasman market, and that it should also reduce duplication for entities operating in both countries by enabling shared systems, processes, and expertise. We also can learn from Australia's implementation experience because they have already implemented their version of this standard, which is called AASB S2. So many abbreviations in the world of reporting. Please do ask questions if you can't keep up with all the different words that we're using. Apologies, we've got a bit of I think it's keeping on going. We do know, however, that New Zealand's starting point is different. Climate reporting entities are already reporting. It's not the kind of first step up from one reporting standard to the next. From nothing to something. It is going from one standard to the next. So we're really, really keen to hear views on this harmonisation point. And then finally, the third principle is local relevance. So the idea is that this New Zealand standard, this New Zealand IFRS S2, so NZ IFRS S2, it would start from that core of IFRS S2, but it would include modifications where needed for New Zealand. Two types of modifications we have to consider. Firstly, there are technical amendments which may be needed to fit with New Zealand's legislative and regulatory settings. So those are just key things that we need to do because reporting standards in New Zealand are issued as secondary legislation. And so we have to make sure that our secondary legislation is consistent with primary legislation, for example. And then we also are very interested, apologies, I think there is an automatic go forward on this slide pack. And then we also need to think about any other local modifications that we hear from you or we consider might be otherwise needed to fit with New Zealand's market settings or experience or size or whatever it may be. However, we really want to hear any compelling reason or reasons that you have for those modifications. We really want to do the best that we can to have a consistent standard, and we really want to hear, if there should be any changes to that IFRS core, what should they be, and what are the compelling reasons for that? The transition is designed to be phased and manageable. So we are proposing issuing this NZ IFRS S2, climate-related disclosures, and we're proposing issuing that, should feedback support that direction, at the end of August next year, which means that it would be available for early adoption by climate reporting entities for reporting periods beginning on or after 1 October 2026. However, mandatory application would take a bit longer, and we're proposing that would not be mandatory until reporting periods beginning on or after 1 January 2033. During that transition period, so climate reporting entities have two options. They can choose to continue applying NZCS until they're required to do so, that mandatory adoption date, or they can elect to early adopt NZ IFRS S2. However, if you do elect to early adopt NZ IFRS S2, you can't go back the other way. So the idea is it's a one-way shift from one reporting standard to the next. And I'll talk a bit later, we are asking questions about this time frame. All right, what information are we seeking? So this is the consultation. Lisa, any questions in the chat at this point that I need to respond to? You're on mute, Lisa.
Yes, we do have one, Amelia. It's a very long question, but basically I'll try and summarise it. So the question is, a big driver in the MB consultation to change the existing CRD regime was to align with Australia, which is supported, but the MB consultation didn't really do this in practice. With the current roadmap consultation to more properly align with Australia, how might that impact recent political decisions to change thresholds for CEs by substantially raising market cap? Australia doesn't use market cap reporting entity thresholds. It uses revenue and assets and headcount, which is also more in line with what other markets do. New Zealand feels a bit of an anomaly in this respect. So he's talking about the thresholds based on market cap versus...
So the role of the XRB is, well, there are two roles. So the government decides the who. So that in primary legislation, the who is established. So what type of entity, what size of entity, etc. And then it is up to the XRB to set the what. So we aim to set reporting standards that are fit for purpose for the who that the government has decided to outline in primary legislation. In terms of the market cap or the reasoning, I mean, that's a government decision about how New Zealand decides to set its reporting thresholds. For example, in New Zealand, we don't require external public reporting by private entities, which is required in Australia through their Corporations Act. So yeah, it's very much a government decision about the who, and then we just set the reporting standard based on the what. So we consider that this proposed strategic direction is suitable for the who that the government is proposing changing to. So very much we have aimed to be responsive to that domestic change in policy setting with the what that we are now proposing. But yeah, in terms of any comments about market cap or whatever is the way to identify entities, that is a question we can pass on to MB that feedback. But yeah, hopefully that answers the question. And if not, please put another question in the chat and I'll do my best to answer. Right, so we're having this consultation now. We're very keen to get your views and any supporting evidence before we make any final decisions. The first consultation question, which is the overarching question, is do you support the proposed strategic direction? We're really keen to know about your view on the overall strategic choice that we are making here. But also, as always, for all of the questions in this consultation, we very keen on reasons and supporting evidence. Feedback on this wider question will help determine whether the XRB proceeds with the roadmap as proposed. And I will just point out, if you don't support the proposed direction, please do still give us your feedback on the other questions if you can, because we're interested in your views, even if, if most people support the direction, we would hate to lose your input on those other sub questions. We also, as I said before, we expect the benefits of the draft roadmap to outweigh the costs. We've got these proposed potential benefits around international comparability, support for access to overseas capital, simplified compliance for some climate reporting entities that operate internationally, access to more expertise, etc. And however, we do expect there to be some costs. So one-off transition costs, and some CREs may face increased ongoing costs because, as I will get to soon, IFRS S2 does contain more detailed disclosure requirements. And we are seeking further information on these benefits and costs. Do you agree with the costs and benefits as we've outlined? And do you have any further information for us? So that's really important for us to know. So, as I said, there are similarities, but there are also differences between IFRS S2 and the existing standard here in New Zealand, Aotearoa New Zealand Climate Standards, NZCS. They are substantially aligned in many areas because they are both structured around the Task Force for Climate-Related Disclosure pillars. They have very similar concepts of materiality and primary user. We have very similar governance disclosures, although there is a bit more detail required in IFRS S2. But there are also differences. So, for example, there are differences in the strategy section around things like scenario analysis, resilience assessment, value chain considerations, metrics and targets, and greenhouse gas emissions measurement. So, for example, the IFRS S2 requires the use of the greenhouse gas protocol, and it also has quite a lot of specific requirements in the standard around emissions reporting, which is all left up to choice in NZCS. We don't prescribe the measurement standard. IFRS S2 also includes what are known as proportionality mechanisms. So there's these concepts of undue cost and effort, etc. So they're very explicit. Whereas NZCS has relied on a much more kind of principles-based approach and then targeted relief through NZCS2, which is the adoption standard. So some similarities, some differences. We are particularly interested in understanding from your perspective what these differences might mean in practice. So, for example, from primary users, we want to know whether adopting IFRS S2 would improve the climate information that you rely on for your decisions. And we also want to know which disclosures you rely on the most and matter the most for your decisions. And then from a climate reporting entity perspective, we do want to know whether you consider whether any IFRS S2 requirements should be removed or changed for New Zealand. Remembering that we do require compelling reasons to be identified for those changes. And then we're also seeking views if you think any existing NZCS requirements should be carried forward into NZ IFRS S2. So just very, very keen. We've got a whole lot of detail in the consultation document, and the consultation document refers off to other documents like comparison material. So yeah, the more detail that we can get on these questions from your perspective, the better from our point of view. Yes, Lisa.
Should we do some questions, Amelia?
Absolutely. I'll go back before I hit on Australia.
Okay, so the first question is, does the XRB expect to adopt assurance requirements that align with Australia? Would assurance requirements apply for early adopters, or would they take effect across the board from 2023? And actually, we've got another question. Would you expect New Zealand to require assurance over the entire report, similar to the approach? Okay, so there's two questions there around assurance.
Great questions. So, assurance does not change. There is no change to assurance as a result of this proposed roadmap. What does that mean? The level of assurance remains the same, limited. The scope of limited at a minimum. You may, if you wish, go to reasonable assurance. The scope of assurance, mandatory assurance, remains the same. Greenhouse gas emissions only. That is specified in New Zealand's primary legislation. What we will need to do from a technical standpoint to make this standard work in New Zealand is to specify the scope of assurance because of that primary legislative requirement that it's only over greenhouse gas emissions. So, as we have now in NZCS1, we have a section that says this is the scope of assurance, these are the disclosures that assurance covers. We will do the same for an NZ IFRS S2, but it doesn't change the level, the nature, etc. of the assurance. It doesn't change who does the assurance. All of that is stays the same.
Okay, we also had another one on assurance, but I think you have answered that. And then we have one more here, which is a good question. So basically, do you think this will be the final change to climate standards? So I guess will the XRB update standards as the ISSB makes updates? Will New Zealand have influence over the changes? I think people are feeling compliance fatigue with climate reporting, and constantly changing the standards will just add to this. Compliance costs have been high today, as evidenced in the MB consultation. So are you happy to take that one away?
Sure, happy to take that one. So we are doing, as I'll get to this very at the end, we are doing a minor amendment, proposing a minor amendment to NZCS1 at the moment through a short consultation that's running from now until the end of this month. The aim is to align NZCS's requirements with those of IFRS S2 to make sure that New Zealand is not more onerous. So yes, that is an amendment that is happening. Our proposal is that there would be no further amendments to NZCS after that amendment. So that then enables clarity that that is NZCS and that will sit as it is. And you can either keep reporting against that or you can shift to the new standard. However, by taking on an IFRS standard, an international standard, the expectation is that you keep that standard up to date as per the international standard. So that is what happens with all the financial reporting standards. If the IFRS decides to update that standard, it will issue an exposure draft of that standard, which we would then issue in New Zealand, gather New Zealand views, and influence, aim to influence back up to the IFRS, or to the ISSB for their decision making. I cannot promise that the ISSB would or wouldn't make any changes, but very much that is that's the situation that you kind of get into when you take an international standard, is that you do kind of take on that that constant updating process that international board may wish to make. How we go about influencing standards. So we are very active in engaging with the ISSB. We have a lot of input into technical staff and board members. We are a member of our Asian Oceanian Standard Setters Group's working group on sustainability reporting, which has a seat on an advisory forum to the ISSB. So there are lots of different ways that we aim to provide New Zealand's feedback up into those. But yes, key answer is NZCS would remain the same following this final amendment. We cannot tell you whether or not IFRS S2 would change, but we would expose that proposal in New Zealand, and then we would expose a proposed change to NZ IFRS S2. So if between now and 2033, assuming that timeframe stays, we would have to go through that normal standard setting process of exposing that and deciding what to do. Is there anything you'd add to that answer, Lisa?
No, that's very good. And we've got a excellent explanation. Thank you. So thank you. We have got a couple more questions here. Do you want to take those now?
Sure.
Okay. This may be more of a legislative question, but would a possible outcome of this be that in time legislation might change, and in time it may be possible for an Australian parent company to publish a single report that satisfies the reporting requirements of both the Australian parent and its New Zealand subsidiaries? So I guess it's kind of back to the who question.
It is
Um,
back to the who. So yeah, so who is a climate reporting entity is defined in legislation. There are climate reporting entities and group climate reporting entities. Um, the issue of recognition, so that is where one country recognises the reporting of another. That was something we heard really strongly during the request for information last year, but that is a decision that the regulators go through. So at the moment, the FMA have granted exemptions to Australian entities to list who are listed on the NZX, so they can lodge their Australian report because we have granted recognition to them. But in terms of further legal change as to definitions of climate reporting entity, that is up to the government.
okay, couple more. Um, Presumably, this will also help with guidance. Guidance on key aspects of NZCS has been incredibly slow, and 3 years on, some guidance is still outstanding. So I guess we could talk about how our approach to guidance will change.
Yes. So what we expect the approach to guidance would be is that we would then issue. So we are aiming to keep all existing guidance available to climate reporting entities during the transition period. But the IFRS, the ISSB, publishes guidance on disclosure. And then at jurisdiction level, that guidance is then kind of issued at jurisdiction level. So Australia, the Australian Accounting Standards Board has issued most of the ISSB's guidance. But I would like to emphasize that is very much about disclosure. It is not about how to do the thing that supports the disclosure. So we have issued some of that in New Zealand. So that is on transition planning, for example, scenario analysis, and we're looking to publish the guidance on anticipated financial impacts very soon this month. That guidance is outside and different to the disclosure guidance. So the XRB would be very keen to hear your views as to whether or not that guidance is still helpful, whether or not we should be still looking to keep that in the market. The reason why we have issued that how-to guidance is because we know that no one else has been issuing that, and we thought that it would be useful given this is such a new reporting regime. But yeah, that's that issue of guidance, very keen for feedback on as well, if you have any thoughts.
Okay, we have another one, and I could probably answer this. Will there be adoption provisions for early adopters? No. So the proposal is obviously we have a very long transition period. So that allows the entities to make that choice to either early adopt or not. So we do have that covered in the consultation document as well, explaining why we've approached it that way. The next question we have, or it's more of a comment. So just a comment, the absence of proportionality principles in entities combined with its principle-based application has drove significant compliance costs for many entities early in their climate reporting journey, and arguably didn't result in more meaningful disclosures due to the focus on compliance versus rather than decision usefulness. Would be good for the XRB could consider providing clarity by being more prescriptive on the scope.
I think that might mean on the scope of the proportionality mechanisms. So so the proportionality mechanisms are not explained in IFRS S2. However, that is an area where the absence of explanation has caused some consternation in those jurisdictions who have picked up that standard. So you might have seen that the Australian government is proposing doing a consultation on whether the Australian government should issue some guidance about what those proportionality mechanisms mean in practice in Australia. The ISSB specifically identifies guidance on proportionality mechanisms as something that individual jurisdictions can provide. So yes, would be very keen on feedback about those proportionality mechanisms, how you think they might work in practice. As I said, a bit of consternation, particularly in terms of how they are interpreted between reporting entities and assurance providers.
Right, Amelia, I'm going to let you get on with the
Excellent.
presentation.
Thanks, Lisa. Please keep those questions coming. Very helpful. Right. There are different, so we've got this principle of Australian harmonisation, but there are differences between IFRS S2 and the Australian reporting framework. The reason I say framework is because Australia has put some things into their standard and it has also put some things into their primary legislation. Two key areas are relevant here. Firstly, industry-based metrics, and secondly, scenario analysis. AASB S2 does not currently require entities to refer to the SASB-based industry guidance, which is a requirement in IFRS S2. So they've basically taken that out of their standard. But Australia has announced that it does intend to finalise mandatory industry-based requirements by 2030. So we're very keen, but then other jurisdictions, for example, have kept those SASB standards in, but just referred to them as a may consider rather than a shall consider. So we're very keen to know your views on those industry-based metrics. And then secondly, in terms of scenario analysis, the Australian primary legislation requires two temperature-defined scenarios, so analysis of a 1.5 degree and a well exceeding 2 degree. So whereas IFRS S2 doesn't specify temperature outcomes, and those Australian temperature outcomes are aligned with Australia's temperature goals. As some of you will know, NZCS requires 3 scenarios. And so we are very keen to understand your views about how New Zealand should consider these Australian harmonisation points, given that Australia has differed from IFRS S2. And so obviously we're very keen to understand, where you are coming from in terms of your perspectives on these questions. Are you a trans-Tasman entity? Are you an entity that operates in other markets, for example? How important is Australian alignment versus that kind of more, consistent international alignment there? Or should we keep some of the New Zealand requirements? And then finally, that local relevance. So our objective is to issue an NZ IFRS S2 that is fit for purpose for New Zealand while remaining as aligned as possible with the IFRS S2. So NZ IFRS S2 aligned as possible with IFRS S2. We are unique in that we're transitioning from existing domestic standards rather than taking these on from scratch. And what does that mean? That means that we know that climate reporting entities, and their advisors have had 3 years of practical implementation experience, and primary users have had 3 years experience with reading climate statements prepared in accordance with NZCS. So we are very keen to understand, that reporting practice and market context that we have, should we have any other amendments. As I said, we will make legislative and we will make technical amendments to ensure consistency with our domestic legal framework. But we're really, really keen to know about whether there should be any other proposed changes. And in the consultation document, we have a big table that explains what some other jurisdictions have done in terms of their own specific amendments. So, for example, South Korea has made some disclosures optional, and the way that the standards are implemented in different countries does differ. And then just a final point there is that we do mention in the consultation document that locally relevant modifications may affect whether climate reporting entities can state compliance with ISSB climate requirements. And so we're interested to know whether that is an issue and whether entities are interested in that idea of stating compliance with ISSB climate requirements, noting that any entity reporting in New Zealand would definitely need to state compliance with the New Zealand standard. Lisa.
No, you're okay. You're probably going to cover it later. I was just going to talk about maybe the compelling reason.
Uh, yes, that is the next slide. So we are very keen for any additions, removals, or changes. We will need a compelling reason to be identified. What do we mean by that? We mean things like cost, practical difficulty, usefulness of information to primary users, and whether the change supports the purpose of climate reporting in New Zealand. In the Financial Reporting Act, there is a section 19B of the Financial Reporting Act, which specifies the purpose of climate reporting. And so all our decisions at the XRB have to be in accordance with that. We have to do our very best analysis to understand that the standards that we propose will meet that purpose. So yeah, very, very keen. And that purpose is all over the consultation document, so you'll be able to read that. And so those are kind of the specifics of the requirements that we're interested in getting feedback on. We're also very keen to get feedback on the time frame. So we are proposing quite a long transition period before NZ IFRS S2 would become mandatory. There is that early adoption. We're proposing early adoption from 1 October reporting periods, beginning on or after 1 October 2026. But and NZCS would remain available during the transition period. The aim of that transition period is to give climate reporting entities time to develop capability, time to update systems and processes, and prepare high quality disclosures. So at any point from that in that transition period, an entity may switch over, but as I said before, it may not switch back. So that is all the questions that we are asking your feedback on. In terms of how the consultation will run, the consultation is open now until Wednesday, 30 September 2026. We're keen to get your feedback in the way that is most convenient for you. So we're going to have some virtual and in-person feedback forums, but you are always encouraged and able to provide us written submissions in addition or instead of attending a feedback forum. You can email us those written submissions. And while you do not need to answer every question, but just please, do respond to those that you have evidence on or information on and you consider relevant to give us feedback. The final roadmap will be shaped by what the XRB hears through this consultation. So, that final roadmap we are proposing issuing at the end of this year. And we are particularly interested in terms of, specifics in hearing from those with implementation experience, applying both NZCS and AASB S2, and or primary users who have experience in reading climate statements or sustainability reports, as they're known in Australia, from both standards. So, yeah, any supporting evidence you can provide is very, very useful. Yes, Lisa.
We have a good question. Well, so I'm confused re justifying modifications.
Sure.
Surely we align with IFRS S2 or we don't. And is there a view that we simply align with IFRS S2 regardless of whether Australia is or not? How many other jurisdictions have made local modifications? So there's a few little questions in there.
Sure. So to take the last one, I would say many jurisdictions have made modifications to IFRS S2. They range, the most substantive tend to be that making the SASB, those industry-based metrics, either optional or completely cutting them. So that is what, for example, Japan, UK, Australia have done, and from various approaches. Then there are other smaller changes that other jurisdictions have made around cutting particular disclosure requirements. As you saw, Australia has changed some of the, they have specified further detail outside the standard for scenario analysis. And so that question of, do you fully align or not? We could, if we get feedback saying, just take IFRS S2, make 0 changes to it, have it all as is written. If that's the majority feedback, we will really take that on board. The only thing, we have to do is, as I said, make it fit with the legislative settings here in New Zealand. Is that, did I capture the full breadth of that question, Lisa, in my answers? Anything I need to add?
I mean, I think it's a very good question, and that will be the challenge to us to kind of work through that. But I guess we very much recognise that we've had 3 years of people reporting, and I don't think we should ignore the knowledge that people have gained throughout that process. So that is why we want to hear from you. Of course, if it comes back that everyone is happy, then we will make decisions based on the information that we get. We've got a few more questions. Next one. XRB in its consultation suggests that changing wording from shall to may would have a significant effect on the effect of the standards. Is there a risk that such changes, mandatory to voluntary, will move the NZ IFRS S2 version too far from the intended objective of disclosures?
So, yeah, it's a great question. We are very keen to understand uh, should any become a may versus a shall. As I said right at the beginning, we really need to understand the level of cost and the level of benefit from the disclosure. We are very aware that in some jurisdictions, the size of entity that is applying the IFRS S2 standard is very, very large. So, for example, in Japan and Korea, the smallest entity applying this, their version of the IFRS S2 standard is bigger than New Zealand's biggest company. So we do really want to know whether any of the IFRS S2 requirements, for example, are too onerous for the size of entity that New Zealand has. That is one, thing that we are interested in, as I mentioned, cost. We're also really interested in knowing, is there anything that's missing from IFRS S2 that would not enable the standard to meet the purpose of climate reporting as outlined in our primary legislation. So those are all the kind of factors that we are looking to understand when we think about, whether a requirement should go from may to must. This is quite different to the long established financial reporting, which we're very conscious still that this is a new reporting requirement globally.
Couple more questions. Will the ISSB guidance be reissued by the XRB with consideration of the local context?
That is our expectation, yes. So the um, the guidance is part of the IFRS suite of material. We couldn't change it too much. We'd have to be really, we'd have to think about how we do that to make it fit for purpose for New Zealand. But that is kind of the ongoing challenge when you take an international standard and you have to think, well, our goal is, as we say, internationally aligned, locally relevant. What is that? Where does it sit in that balance between what is required and what is what might be changed for a domestic context. I think we are always very conscious about the type of entity that the IFRS generally has in mind when it drafts its standards. And are those, how many of those, or what are the types of entities that suit in the New Zealand market? We, even with the proposed changes from the government around who is a climate reporting entity, we do still have some entities that will remain that are a bit outside the box. So, for example, maybe some of our large debt issuers, which are public sector entities, how do we think about the guidance in their context? So we will continue to look at that.
Okay, here's another question. What challenges have other jurisdictions faced when implementing IFRS S2 so far?
Well, that is a really, really good question because there's actually not much implementation experience. So what do we know? We know that some entities have changed their entire regime. So, for example, we know that Brazil had proposed proposed implementing on a fully mandatory basis, and they're proposing going back to a fully comply or explain basis. We know that the application of assurance requirements in Australia has been challenging for many entities. We know that the provision of data for things like scenario analysis, etc., has been really challenging in some entities. So different challenges, some different, some similar, but the general experience of implementing climate reporting, and this includes in Europe through their standards, is that it is really much a big uplift in that first year. And then from the second year onwards, it does get significantly easier and less costly. That is the general experience to date. But yeah, we are, as I said before, we're particularly interested in hearing from those that have experience implementing AASB S2, because that's that kind of real practical experience that we're very keen to hear.
And I think too with Australia coming on board, and we're seeing lots of reports come out of Australia um, from people analysing and kind of giving views on what the challenges are. So there's been quite a lot of that, and there will be more as the 30th of June reporters start to report and see that coming through. But it would probably be fair to say, Amelia, that the challenges that we have had in New Zealand are probably similarly felt by others.
Yeah,
I've got a few more
absolutely.
questions. The main goal is certainly surety, and IFRS as an international standard provides this. I fear too much has been kicked down the road instead of just facing into key disclosures such as Scope 3 and anticipated financial effects or impacts, etc. New Zealand is not so special in this regard. So I think that's more of a comment, possibly. Next question. How would compliance be enforced during the transitional period, considering there will be a mix of early adopters and those who stick with NZCS? Would there be any leniency during this period?
So when you choose, you have to choose a single reporting standard. You can't mix and match. And so you do have to, as per the primary legislation, state compliance with the standard that you have applied. And that will be the standard that the regulator, the FMA, will be looking at to make sure you have complied with. So it is up to the FMA to determine whether, what their monitoring and regulatory approach would be for any entities that decide to early adopt an NZ IFRS S2. But yeah, that is for the regulator to communicate.
Okay, we've got, answer live. Most entities in New Zealand will not be able to cope with many of the shell requirements from IFRS. From our experience working with with an Australian parent on AASB S2, the IFRS S2 is a lot more prescriptive and challenges with assurance over disclosure, e.g. risks and opportunities. Take financed emissions as an example. Most in New Zealand will not be able to absorb the additional costs required to meet the IFRS disclosure requirements. So
That is another comment.
yeah.
Yeah, if that is your view and you have implementation experience on that, we would be very, very keen to obtain, for you to communicate that to us, particularly backed up by your experience, that evidence of your experience. As I said, we always aim for our standards to be fit for purpose for the entities that are applying them. We have done our best to identify those proposed benefits and costs, but we are seeking your feedback on whether we have got those benefits and costs right, and whether there are any specific requirements that may need amendment to fit New Zealand settings.
I was just going to do an additional shout out, Amelia. I mean, people that have got implementation experience of AASB2 and NZCS, we would love to even have a chat to you. So
Mhm.
if you're keen to just send us a message and we could maybe organise a little verbal meeting, because I think that'll be really, really helpful for us to dig in to a bit more detail around some of those differences between.
Absolutely. And so, we are encouraging you to engage now on the substance of what could be in that potential exposure draft. So, as you will see in the roadmap, if supported, if this strategic direction is supported, we do plan to consult very early next year on an exposure draft of that NZ IFRS S2, and that accelerated consultation would enable us to enable that early adoption by 1 October. So this is a really key chance. We're really keen to hear from you about what could or should be included. And as I said before, even if you don't support the strategic direction, please then do give us your feedback on the other questions if you do have views, because that will all be useful. So that is everything on the consultation. Oh, sorry, screen sharing has stopped. Okay. Um, but as I mentioned, we do have another consultation out on greenhouse gas emissions. It's on our website. I'm very keen to hear from you on that point. And yeah, Lisa, do we have any other questions?
Yes, we do, and we will apologise for the screen. It wasn't like what we were trying to keep the boss to task and on time. Would there be any changes to the due date of the report? Our parent company in Australia releases theirs a lot earlier than we do in New Zealand, believe because of their requirements.
Your reporting deadline is based on primary legislation. So you must re, you we this reporting standard will have no implication on when your report is required, because that is set in primary legislation.
And we just had someone giving us a thank out for this. Thank you for the session. Thank you.
So if you have any other questions following this session, please do get in touch with us. That's sustainability@xrb.govt.nz. Please do go read the documents on the website, read the roadmap first, and then read that the consultation document. As I said, we will be running some feedback forums. We're reaching out to key industry associations. So if you belong to an industry association that's relevant here, you might get a feedback forum via that. And then we're also running some ones that we are organising at the XRB, and you can always provide us with your written feedback. So thank you again. Really appreciate your feedback and your comments. Look forward to engaging with you as the consultation proceeds. Mā te wā.